Now, we'll get back to the beginning.
Okay.
What can you tell me about your family? How many children were you?
Okay. When I was born in Stettin, which is the entry from the North Sea into the Oder, and we were my father, my mother, and they had 6 children. I only remember 5 because the first baby apparently died, and my mother couldn't attend the funeral because she went into labor with my oldest brother, who was 5 years older than I. And his name was Felix, and he was born on April the 15th, and that became for her, for my mother, a magic date. As a matter of fact, the reason I mention it is because throughout the time in the camps, she kept talking, to the women. All you have to remember, when is April the 15th? Because on April the 15th will be the Geula. And so the women, we had no calendars, and the women would get busy trying to find out what month we are in, and the discussions were almost ludicrous. Today it's raining and it must be close to April and so on. So you can imagine hundreds of women busy trying to figure out how soon April the 15th would be. And April the 15th rolled around, and by that time we were in a different camp. So I didn't realize how effective this was until there was here a gathering, 50 years of Auschwitz survivors. And by a series of coincidences that are too impossible to relate, a little old lady sat in the wrong room, 2 seats away from me. I was furious because it was poorly organized. Anyhow, this woman takes out her water bottle and she starts to say, "Oi," she says, "Oi, this is terrible." She says, "Almost as bad as Bergen-Belsen." So I say, "Bergen-Belsen? Bergen-Belsen was not the worst camp." So she says, "To me, it was the worst camp because I gave everything in Bergen-Belsen." I understood what she meant. To me, Plaszow was the worst camp, even though in relation to other camps, it wasn't. But that's where I gave. My brother, Achim, my little brother, was taken from us, 1944. That's very late. And anyhow, so she said, I said to her, I mentioned something about Majdanek. So she says, "I was in Majdanek." And says, where did you come to Majdanek from?" She says, "From Radom." I says, "From Radom?" I says, "What did you do in Radom?" She says, "I worked in the shoppen." I says, "You worked in the shoppen? Did you what did you do?" So she said she was working for so-and-so who was a shirt maker, a men's shirt maker. Now, my mother and I, we were working in the shoppen in Radom. This was after the ghetto was liquidated. They allowed about 1,200 Jews out of 35,000 Jews that were liquidated in one night. 1,200 were selected to work in the shoppen and in related factories. And my mother had learned, she didn't tell you all this story, but when when we were deported, and the kids went to a summer camp, she went to an art school, art school, ORT, and she became a corset and brassiere designer. So on the basis of that, she became an expert for the shoppen. So the room in which the corset makers were working was the same room where these shirt makers were working. I did not remember this woman, but I did remember her boss, in other words, the man who she worked for. So I says, did you remember Peppy Berger? Oh, Peppy Berger, tell me, how is the little girl? So I said, "You mean Marlet?" She says, "No, that wasn't her name. She had a different name." I said, "Mushi?" She says, "Yes, that's her name. That was her nickname."
Oh,
and I said, "Well, I'm her daughter, her older daughter." "Oh, you're the big one. I says, "My name is Judy." She says, "No, that's not your name." And the truth is that I have 2 names. My first name is Irmgard, and they called me Irmi, and my second name is Judith. And after the war, I didn't use Irmgard very much for obvious reasons. So she says, "Of course you're Irmi, tell me about your big brother, and tell me about April the 15th.
so much.
Can
there
you
was
imagine? This is 50 years later, and this woman we had no contact whatsoever. It was a pure coincidence that we met, and she says, your mother, what she accomplished, and this was one of the things. Well, anyhow.
We'll get.
Yeah, the date became a talisman and became a mantra, really, by which she saved the lives of many, many women, many. And throughout the entire experience, that's what she did. She didn't just care for herself; she cared also for others. For example, going on much later, we were in Plaszow. And Plaszow was the first time that we saw Hungarian Jews coming in. They were coming to Plaszow after they had already been in Auschwitz. So they were traumatized, almost like black slaves off of a slave ship. Their hair were shaven, and they were in these gray uniforms. Once maybe there were stripes, but the stripes had been washed off, so they were gray. And they were frightened, and they were unfriendly. They couldn't communicate. They couldn't speak Yiddish. They couldn't speak Polish. They were afraid of Jew and non-Jew because they had experienced bad things in such a fast, in such a rapid pace. My feelings about them was very hostile because I felt this was 1944. This was June. We had already lost our little Achim, who was taken from us in May 1944. And this was June. And I said to myself, we are already 6 years under the yoke of the Nazis, and here they're coming from Hungary, and they didn't get away. They didn't escape. They didn't manage to hide. And what right do they have to still be sitting there and waiting for the Nazis to get hold of them, you know? So I really didn't feel very friendly towards them, especially since they were so hostile. You couldn't ask them, you couldn't talk to them. My mother at that time, we worked in a laundry, and I was able to bring a little extra bread from someplace, which I'll talk about later. But in any case, we had a little extra bread than we absolutely needed. So my mother took that bread and she went out, and as they were coming in rows of 5, totally disoriented, totally impossible to talk to, she went with the bread and she tried to talk to them and they wouldn't. So she just went and hugged them. She just went and hugged them and put a piece of bread in their mouth. And she went from one to the other and she tried to speak German, Yiddish, anything, just hugged them and put a piece of bread in their mouth. Until she came across the most unattractive girl of the whole bunch. I mean, it's bad enough not to have hair and to be under this trauma, but this was truly, from birth, an unattractive, tall, gangly girl. Not a good feature in her face. So as my mother was hugging her, she spoke German, and she says, I will distribute the bread for you. So she gave other people bread, and my mother started talking with her, and so she explained to my mother why they are so traumatized, that they just now had gone through a selection and that almost all of them were total orphans who had come to Plaszow. And she, as it turned out, was the daughter of a rabbi from Frankfurt am Main who had a brother living in Hungary. And when the Nazi period started, he had 2 daughters. He sent his 2 daughters away. And one of them he managed to get to Switzerland. And the other one he managed to get to Hungary. And she, later on, how did she get out? She was brought out from a rabbi's home. The brother was a rabbi too in Hungary. I forgot the name of the town. But she was a learned woman. And my mother gave her extra ration of food so she would teach us. Now my sister wasn't terribly interested because teaching meant that we had to walk together And she would talk, and it wasn't a question of sitting down and having a classroom, you know,
Yeah.
it was a question of doing work
And listening.
and
at the same
listening.
time.
And the problem was getting her to the workstation where we were, which was impossible because she was a newly arrived one, which meant that I had to go to her workstation, which usually was terrible because the newcomers were sent to the quarry. And so I got her away from the quarry, but it was not a good job. It was a job outdoors. But she, as we were working together, she was teaching me. How did she know? She says that her father had no sons, and he was a Talmud Chochem, and he had apparently a small yeshiva in this house in Frankfurt am Main. Apparently there were many such. And so he said to his daughters, look, the Rebbeinu Shalom knows what he's doing. If he didn't give me sons and he gave me Chochmah, that means he wants me to teach my daughters. So he put a mechitza in the Bes Medrash, and he put his two daughters behind it, and they were absorbing. They had the books, and they were absorbing. She was my teacher in Plaszow, and this you will never believe. Her sister, Doris, who married an Erlanger from Switzerland, was my teacher in Switzerland after the war.
Really?
So, you know, these stories they seem coincidences, but they're not. Anyhow, my family, my father was truly a Yeke. He had been brought up as an only son by a woman who had a very good business and whose pride and joy it was to support her Talmud Chochem husband. My grandfather Eliezer, the story was that he never worked, not a day of his life. He was in the yeshiva for many years, and then he was learning in his home. But they did live in a town in Germany called Recklinghausen, which is a small town in Westphalia, not far from Dortmund. And there one part of the house was arranged as a shul, and they had a minyan there every day, and whoever came through the town would have a place to sleep and to eat, and so on. And but that's all he did. He learned by himself, he learned with others, he conducted the services, and that was his life. And she had two children. She had my father first, and then she had a daughter, Hannah. And my father was very much indulged, and he was raised in the Shita of Samson Raphael Hirsch, that you Teurem Derech Emes, and he was very, very observant. But he was I guess he had an MBA in textile. He was a merchant, was very proud of it. And as soon as Hitler came to power, he was a wholesale merchant. This was very bad for him, because he didn't have the skills to start crawling, you know, and doing little shtiklach illegally. But at that point, my mother, I think, was able to maneuver a little bit better. Her background had prepared her better for this. He was rather loved luxury, loved elegance, loved, needed a maid for himself.
But you lived in Stettin, not
We
in
lived in
Recklinghausen.
Stettin. No. They lived in Recklinghausen for a short period of time. I think that must have been during the Depression that they moved to Recklinghausen, because my grandmother at that time felt that she needed somebody to take over the business. It was a furniture business. And my mother didn't want to go there. It was too much of a province, number one. Number two, she had 4 siblings in Stettin. Her only brother and 4 of her sisters, all of them older than she, lived in Stettin. And there was a lot of strength in it. You know, we had cousins and parties with the cousins, and one of my uncles was in charge of bringing in the rabbi and the moel and the cantor. So they were big machers in Stettin, and she was very closely attached to her siblings. And my father started to work in the family business of her family. In other words, but then in 1930, they moved to Recklinghausen to see whether this would be better, because he already felt the coming of the anti-Semitic wave that was to follow. And my sister, Marlet, was born in Recklinghausen in 1930. And in 1933, when my mother was pregnant with the youngest boy, with Achim, my father wanted very much to go to Holland because he saw something wasn't, things weren't right. He wanted to go to Holland. My mother said, no, I'm pregnant. I'm not going to go to a foreign country. I won't know anybody. I won't know the language. This is ridiculous. We're going back to Stettin. So they moved back to Stettin. And there they found a new situation because in 1933, two things. First of all, my mother was no longer allowed to deliver her baby in a maternity hospital. So her doctor, who was a very dear friend, Dr. Arnheim, smuggled her in, as it were, to a private clinic under, some whatever, so that she would be able to give birth in this clinic. Because the clinic also was not supposed to take Jewish clients, even though it was owned by a Jewish doctor. And the other thing they found is that they could not move back into their home. They had had one half of a villa on a very prestigious street, Kaiser Wilhelmstraße, and when they came back in 1933, Jews could no longer live there or rent there. As a matter of fact, it was very difficult for my father to find a suitable apartment because we were by that time a large family. She was expecting, her fifth child. And so they found a sublet. The reason I'm mentioning it because it's part of the story. The sublet was on a very good street, but it was upstairs. It was on the third floor, and the apartment was owned by the widow of a World War I German war hero, and she lived on her widow's pension, which over a period of time became inadequate. So she had her large apartment remodeled in such a way that there was, for herself, she had a living room, a bedroom, kitchenette, and the rest of the apartment was for the tenants. Apparently we were not the first tenants, but we certainly were the first Jewish tenants. As a matter of fact, we were the first Jews she ever saw. Her name was Frau Stockmeier. She was at that time very arthritic, an older woman, but a lovely woman, very Mesudar. And she fell in love with this little mother of mine who was working day and night and cooking in the kitchen. And they shared the same water source. So this Frau Stockmeier wanted to be very, very delicate and not intrude on my mother when she was doing things about kashrus. Everything was about kashrus, so she was always very careful when she came to refill her pots and pans. They became very close. And in 1930, I just give you a background of what happened to her when they had elections in 1933. She went to the polls. And the polls, I don't know if you have ever seen the election ballots. The ballots had the name Adolf Hitler very large with a big "Ja," in these Roman letters. And underneath they had a small "No" and room for the Social Security number. Name, Social Security, no, not name, Social Security number or whatever that was, their pension number, and no. Well, she apparently felt that this was a complete negation of democracy and of anything that she felt was important. So she came back with this ballot, and she couldn't walk. I mean, she had to take a taxi or something. She came back to tell my mother about it, and she was very upset, and she said, if you can give me the amount of the pension, I would vote no. So my mother consulted my father, and my father said it isn't just the pension. If she says no, she will not only lose her pension, but she will probably lose much more than that, because it was a threatening thing, So he said, first of all, I'm not in a position to give you that amount of money plus the rent every month. And second of all, I'm not so sure that I would be doing you a favor even if I could. So she went ahead and like all the other Germans, voted for Hitler. In time, she became the godmother of my little brother. My little brother was born in 1933, was born lovable. He was born totally adorable. And everybody was fighting over taking care of him. All his older siblings, including me. Of course, he was mine. You know, my mother only was there to bring him into the world, but he was mine. But my older brother felt the same way, and so did my brother Eddie. So the poor child was being torn. But the one who used to rescue him was Frau Stockmeier, because she would quietly, on her felt house shoes, she would come in, and she would take him, and she would sit him down in her little kitchen, and that was hers. And she really adored him. And on the night when we were deported, when the two SS-men, one a plainclothesman and one in the police uniform in 1938, this was October the 28th, when they came to the house, she was babysitting for us. My parents were both away. My father was away on business and my mother was away at a meeting. And she didn't want to let them in. And they told her that she should stand aside, and she said, what is the matter with you? These are very fine people, and you have no right, and where's your right? And they said, yes, we do have the right. And whether they showed her something or whether they just pushed her aside, I don't know. But she stood her ground for a long time before she would allow them to come in. And of course, then they stayed in our house, one of them sitting at the windowsill, to make sure that they would spot my parents when they came home. And they waited, as my mother said, they waited until past midnight, until I went to bed. And what I remember very distinctly about them is that I used to put my school books in order the night before. And so I had, on Friday, I had knitting. So knitting involved a korb, you know, a little a basket there where inside I was knitting a sock. That was a big thing, and it was the time of the heel of the sock. And I was very proud. I was just 10. I was very proud that I had figured out how to do the heel. And I was hoping that on Friday the teacher wouldn't tell me to rip everything up. So I went over to the Schupo. Schupo is a regular policeman, to the cop, who actually, I think I knew him. I mean, I had no fear of him. And I said to him, what do you think I should do with my school books? Will we come back before school, or will I be going to school from wherever we're going? He says, well, he says, maybe you better. Maybe you better take it with you, just in case I don't want you to be late for school. So later on, when my father returned, he didn't know that we had been taken. The apartment was sealed up by the Gestapo. Even though they gave my mother the key, they sealed up the apartment, and they already allocated it probably to a functionary. But Frau Stockmeier let him in through her part of the apartment so that he was able to get some stuff out of there for himself. And he had to be in hiding because, unfortunately, by giving the Germans my father's passport, my father was totally disabled. He would have been disabled anyhow because they stamped stateless on the passport. Mm-hmm. And being stateless was the problem was that visas, affidavits, certificates, everything was according to nationality. And if you were stateless, you weren't on any, you couldn't even be on any quota. So that this was a very, very big blow. And from that moment on, my father was on the Gestapo list as a wanted man who didn't conform and didn't get out. So what he apparently did is he rented rooms in 4 different places in Stettin, and he would sleep in a different place every night. And several times we are told he would open the door, the Gestapo would be there, and they would say, you know, we're looking for Herr Berger. And he says, tut mir leid, aber er ist nicht hier. And he looked so, he looked so German, and he had this demeanor. He had no fear. He really believed that this is a passing stage, and only a few of the hooligans are involved, and that his good friends have nothing to do with it. And he had friends on the city council and in other places. Why? Stettin is a harbor,
Yeah.
and it has both the water fish, the freshwater fish from the river, and it has also the sea fish from the Ostsee, from the Baltic. And my father was in charge of buying the fish for every week that my mother processed. Now, at the time that I remember, it was very difficult to get meat or even chicken, because proper Schriete had to be imported from Denmark or certainly from Berlin. But even the Berlin butchers used to get it from Denmark or Belgium or Poland, because there was no Schriete allowed, proper Schriete allowed in Germany anymore. And so my parents relied a great deal on fish. My mother learned how to make fish 50,000 ways, and her Falschenhasen, her chopped fish cutlets, you couldn't tell from meat cutlets. They were fabulous. And I think that it stood us in very good stead later on that we ate fish and vegetables rather than meat and gravy and schmaltz and so on. So my father used to buy the fish, and he bought it right from the boats, they were fishermen living on houseboats. Well, it doesn't take long for fishermen to spot a good customer, because he used to buy really a lot. So he became the darling of these fishermen who vied for his patronage. And in the course of doing that, he saw that their children were running around totally wild, totally uneducated. So he turned to the members of the city council, and he said, the same story as migrant workers, who's going to educate these children? And he was very persistent, and he was able to get some stipend, some schools, to admit some of these fishermen's children who had spent more than X number of months a year in the harbor to be able to attend school. So as a result of that, he knew a lot of these people very well, and they always told him, Herr Berger, das wird alles vorübergehen, sorgen Sie sich nicht, nehmen Sie das nicht so ernst, so on. And he actually, I think he believed it. I think.
But until 38, you were actually living pretty comfortably.
Yeah. Now, the only thing that wasn't comfortable was schooling. My older brothers were already in German schools. Felix was in high school.
There was no Jewish school in Stettin?
They were just starting a Jewish school when I turned 5. Okay? So about 1933, they started 34, they started a Jewish school. But it was very primitive, very elementary. It was held in what used to be the wedding hall. And the teachers were professors who were fired from universities and so on. But I had heard every evening stories that my brothers wouldn't tell my mother, but they told each other about how they got beaten up by fellow students in school. Felix was in high school already, and they didn't want to let go of him because he was a very, very good student and a good athlete. And Eddie was in the Pestalozzi Schule, which was a Volksschule, a lower school. And I remember them coming home and trying to figure out how to explain to my mother that he had a chipped front tooth. So he got beaten up by several of his fellow students with the teacher looking on. So he told my mother that he ran his bicycle into a lamppost because they didn't want to upset her. And the other thing was that my mother could not accompany us to, let's say, the beach, because we used to go every day to the beach. Obviously, we lived near the water. And but there were signs, big signs, Juden verboten, Judeneintritt verboten, and so my mother didn't want to be conspicuous. So Felix, my older brother, used to take all of us to the beach, which involved going by boat and then walking to the beach. We had a wonderful time at the beach, but later on I realized that it was not a normal situation, that Mutti would let Felix, who was at that time, not even bar mitzvah, to take care of, all of them, little Achim, who was 5, and Marlet, who was 3 years older.
So you yourself, what school did you go to?
And I started, and I insisted. I told my mother, I'm not going to any Nazi school, I'm not going to any German school, I'm going to the Jewish school. So at the age of 5, she took me to be tested, and I passed the test. I could read and write because my brothers had taught me. So, and I went always to the Jewish school.
How many Jews lived in Stettin?
I don't know the number, but it was a large community. The Orthodox community was smaller than I guess you would call them, they weren't Reform, but they were certainly conservative. Yeah, they were Reform. Some of them had services on Sunday. Shabbos services on Sunday, and of course they all had organs. They all had mixed seating. No, I'm sorry, they didn't have mixed seating. They had organs, but not mixed seating. And the relationship between the Orthodox community, the Orthodox shul, and the non-Orthodox was cordial because they shared 2 things. First of all, we had to use their sukkah. Our shul did not have a sukkah. So they had a very large sukkah which was beautifully decorated and which had covers on, the crank down covers in case of rain. Well, my father wouldn't sit in a sukkah where there was a possibility of cranking down the sukkah. So he made an arrangement with the Reform temple. They wouldn't crank down the sukkah if he would lend his children for the Simchas Torah akofe, for the Simchas Torah celebration, because they had no children. So every sukkah we had a big fight. We had to watch the custodian, so he wouldn't crank down the roof of the sukkah. And every Simchas Torah, all of his kids would line up, and they would shower us with candy, and the cousins too, with candy and all good stuff, and apples with the flags, and we would march around the Yakovas, the only children, Barrow children. Now, my parents had very good relationships on an individual basis with the Reform Jews, who were by far in the majority. And, for example, we had among our friends, there were birthday parties in the homes of Reform Jewish children, and we knew, my mother had indoctrinated us early on. First of all, we ate before we left. And second of all, that we could only eat raw fruit, nothing processed, raw fruit. And we couldn't even drink soda. I don't know why it was so careful. We were so carefully controlled. Or candy was questioned. Everything was questioned. So my mother said, "That's it. You can eat raw fruit." And somehow we managed to do that. It wasn't a big problem. In school. In my school, the problem was that I was in a grade of 30 children.
Mixed crowd or only religious children?
Totally mixed. Not only were they totally mixed, but half of them, exactly 15 of my classmates, were Mischlinge, children of mixed marriages. And it was a big problem. These were mostly mothers who were Germans, non-Jewish, and the fathers were the ones who were Jewish. There was not a single exception to that. And these children
Hello. Can. No fun video.
Yes.
Okay.
So these children?
Now, these children had it from both sides. In the first place, our school was called the Jüdische Deutsche Volksschule of Stettin, which is sort of an anachronism because Jewish, yes. Volksschule means a state school, which it wasn't. It was private, but it was sanctioned by the state. And so there was this anachronism, and all children who were considered Jews had to eventually go. They were eventually kicked into the school. I was in the grade that started more or less voluntarily, but eventually kids were kicked out of the German schools and into this Deutsche Volksschule, the Jüdische Volksschule. Now, in my grade, the 15 kids who were Mischlinge had it bad from both sides. Their mothers, many of them, were members of the Nazi Party, were anti-Semites who hated Jews, and did not want them associating with Jews. On the other hand, parents like my parents and my uncles and so on didn't want their children associating with these half goyim, you know. And my father was really the only exception of all of the Jewish parents who said, you judge the children on an individual basis. And don't discriminate against them simply because they happen to be unlucky enough to be born in a mixed, mixed marriage. And there was a girl in my class, there were several girls in my class who were important later on in the story, but one of them, a beautiful blonde girl by the name of Helga, and she had invited me over to her house. I mean, she had come to my house and she had invited me over to her house, and I got my father's permission to go, and I went. And at the door, her mother, a tall, statuesque blonde, greeted me, verfluchtes jüdisches, what did she call me? Schmeiß sie sofort raus, das verfluchte jüdische Sau. This to a friend of her, of her daughters. Later on, we had a boy by the name of Norbert Zahler, whose father was Jewish, mother wasn't. And on the night that we were deported, they were also brought. He and his father and the mother and the younger children were all brought to the prison for deportation, because he was apparently of Polish origin, the father. He could have been of Polish origin a generation back, like my father was, but they were considered Ostjuden. And at that point, the wife had a chance to renounce her husband as a rapist and as a despoiler of the races, a Rassenschändler. And if she officially did that and said that the children she has were because he raped her and he was the only reason that he married her was to despoil the races, then very often she could take the children and would not be deported. Now, Norbert Zahler's mother did that the night that we were being deported. Norbert himself was a tall, totally blonde, totally Aryan-looking boy. And his mother was sort of a short, shrimpy woman. In any case, she did this, and we heard it. I heard it, in front of the policeman, and she had to say terrible things about him and denounce him. And so they wrote it all down, and they let her go with the children. So she had Norbert, and then she had two younger children. So she took the younger children, and she started to walk away. And Norbert walked over to his father. So she came back, and she's, Norbert, du kommst mit mir. And he spat her in the face. And he said, du bist nicht mehr meine Mutter. And he stayed with his father, which I'm sure did neither him nor his father in the long run any good. But at the moment it was, for him the right thing to do. I'm mentioning this because to show the conflict that existed with some of these mixed marriages. For example, we had a gym teacher, Joachim Stahl. He had all the grades in gym. I think my sister is here. No? We had a gym teacher who had to be very, very adroit because he didn't have a gym hall. He had to improvise. And yet he did an excellent job. We learned how to rappel on ropes and climb up and jump over horses and so on. He was very, very good. And he was married to a German woman. He looked Aryan and she looked non-Aryan. And they had a little girl. And she did the same thing. She declared him a Rassenschändler, but subsequently she helped him to get out to Palestine with a little girl. She was then arrested and declared a whore, in other words, officially a whore. And I saw her in Auschwitz. She was one of the Schwarzwinklers. I'll tell you in a minute what the Schwarzwinklers mean. Schwarzwinkler was, we all had little triangles, you know?
Yeah.
So the Jews had the yellow one, and the red ones were political prisoners, and the black ones were criminals. And among the criminals, there were also differences. If you were a really bad criminal, you became a very important Schwarzwinkler, because then they trusted you more and you became a capo. She was a Schwarzwinkler with the designation whore. And she recognized me before I recognized her, which I was very surprised at because I had really no contact with her. And she told me not to recognize her and not to do anything. But she was a nurse by profession, and she worked in that experimental place where Mengele and others were conducting fertility experiments. I don't know if you've had any documentation on it. And she was instrumental. There was an opportunity when we were invited from the barracks to go to this place to view a movie, a Christmas movie. This was Christmas 1940, at the very end of 1944. And she made it possible for me to speak to a young woman by the name of Kronberg from Radom, who told me all the things that were going on. And she then told me to convey through her that they should stop being afraid that they are no longer doing life-threatening operations, because a lot of the girls, when they were taken down for operations, they didn't know what was being done to them. You know, some of them came back and they became pregnant, some of them were bleeding, some of them were nauseous. They were doing all kinds of experiments, and a lot of the reactions probably had to do with their terrible, terrible fear. They didn't know what was happening to them. So this Frau Jachimsthal, she told me to tell Kronberg, because she saw, you know, she wanted me to convey to her that from that point on, whatever the operations were, nominally, they are no longer life-threatening, and nothing is being done that will be forever. And she was right. Many years later, I was with my children in the park in the Bronx. And I'm walking with my kids, and a woman's voice calls my name. And she calls Irmi. So I knew that she had to know me from before. So I say, how do you know me? She says, I knew you by your walk. I didn't recognize you from anything else, but I knew you by your walk. And this was the same woman, Kronberg. She was able to give birth. She had difficulties, but she was able to give birth. And she told me the other side of that story, that after this, Frau Jachimsthal conveyed this, and she conveyed it to the other girls, the mortality rate dropped down. Of course, they were taken on death march like all the others, but
yes, but not from these.
Yeah. So this is just to let you see the connection. One of the other girls in my class, who I think was from one of the few mixed marriages where, no, the mother was also not Jewish, but the mother must have been Italian. I don't know. She looked totally Jewish, dark hair, dark brown-eyed. And her name was Schwartz. And Ruth Schwartz, her daughter, who was my classmate, we became friendly for two reasons. We used to run Stafetten, we used to relay races. And she was as tall as I, and she could run as fast as I. My whole story really revolves around the fact that I was born big. And that at the age of 11, I had attained my full height and probably not this girth, but I was fully developed. And therefore, all during the camp years, if I was able to get away by saying, you know, I'm work able, I'm 18, whatever. I could always do that and get away with it because I really was very tall for my age. I have some pictures here, and you can see the relationship to my older brothers. My brother was 5 years older than I, was maybe as tall as me. And my brother, who was 3 years older than me, was shorter, and he hated me for it all his life. We were genetically somewhat divided. My father was more like me and my sister, and anyhow, 3 children were like my mother, and 3 were like my father.
So you're saying about this Ruth Schwartz?
Yeah, this Ruth Schwartz. So she and I got to know each other very well because we ran Stafetten. We used to run relay races together. And another thing that united us was on my 10th birthday, I had asked my parents for a private room. I wanted a separate room. We had been sleeping 4 in the same bedroom. So what do you want from your dream wish? I wanted a separate room. So they couldn't give me that. So they did buy me a bed. I got a new bed. I don't know if it was brand new, but anyhow, it was new with a new feather, this puch feather, and beautiful. It was a white brass bed with gold filials. And I managed to sleep in it for one night. The first and only night that I slept in it was the night of our deportation. But they also gave me a fountain pen. I used to love writing, and in those days the big thing was a pen. Instead of putting into the ink pen, you had one where you could soak up the ink. You had a little lever and you could soak up the ink. And my father knew how much I wanted it, so they got me this green pen, and he said, "You're going to lose it for sure, so I'm going to put your name on the bottom of it." My name was engraved deeply engraved, so that I wouldn't lose it. So I brought it to school, and I was so proud of it. And Ruth Schwartz happened to see it. She says, "I got one just like it for my 10th birthday." And her name was engraved on the top of it, on the cap that you take off. I met Ruth in Majdanek. She and her mother had been selected out when they had killed about 23,000 people, all in a matter of 2 days in Majdanek. The upper echelon of the SS selected for themselves, I think it was 100 women who would be there, whatever. And Renate, her mother, and Ruth were among them. And Ruth recognized me, and they had strict orders not to get in touch with us because they had been through the Aktion and they could testify to what they had seen, and they were destined to be killed probably in Auschwitz, and they knew about it. But the Germans insisted that if they so much as speak to us or speak to any group that comes subsequently, they would be very severely punished. Now they were under the guidance, their Stubenälteste or Kapp or whatever, was a woman whose last name I never knew, but her first name was Nusha, extremely attractive woman who had been an actress in the Warsaw Ghetto. And she had come to Majdanek with a group of children. She had been under the protection of some very important German who told her and promised her that if she goes with the children, she can protect these children. So she came to Majdanek with a group of children, not voluntarily, but she took them under her wings. And of course the children were killed. Her husband was killed. And she had been selected by the most important Nazi in Majdanek as his mistress, as his whatever. And she ordered, when Ruth said that she recognized her classmate among the newcomers from Radom, she ordered Ruth to make contact with us. Mm-hmm. And because of that, we were able to hear all the details of the execution and who did it and how it was done and so on and so forth. It also was very important because we were selected to a workplace where they were repairing baskets from grenades. They were bringing them from the front, and we had to repair them. The work, first of all, was very, very difficult because to pull off the old and to put on the new, the hands were ripped open, and we had no bandages. We had nothing like that. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was that that particular workplace was a recruiting station for whores for the soldiers. Mm-hmm. And the first day that we were there, the Schwarzwinkler, who was the main pimp for them, came in to select his, people who he wanted. And he selected me and brought me to the barracks. Not he brought me, but the Aufseherin, the German one, took me there to the barracks, and he told me, what would be expected, and he gave me some undergarments. Wanted me to put them on. Thank God I remembered my mother wouldn't like it if I got undressed in front of strangers. So instead of putting them on, I just tied them around me. And that night, when Ruth came to the barracks, I'll tell you in a minute under what pretext she came, because it was forbidden. Yeah. I told her about this, and I thought it was a big joke. I told her, I says, can you imagine I was chosen for the harem? And we made a big joke about it. So she told me this is not a joke. This is very serious. He's a vicious capo. And he was recruited as one of the shooters during this execution. And as a matter of fact, he had a girlfriend, a young Jewish girl, who was crazy about him. And he did her the favor of shooting her straight in the head so that she wouldn't be buried alive. That was his big chesed. So she arranged. Her mother talked with this Nusha, and she arranged for 3 new commandos to be formed, the Kleiderkammer, sorting the clothes, which we were not supposed to have gone to, but which they did in order to prevent us, my mother, my sister, myself, and in the course other women too, from being exposed to this particular Korbflechterei, they called it, the basket weaving place. Now, word got out eventually that they had made contact with us, and Nusha was hung by her wrists. And she was something very, very remarkable. She didn't cry out, she didn't tell, and they let her hang there for a long time. Her wrists were never the same. They were always, eventually they cut her down, but her wrists were damaged. And she insisted that they continue making contact with us. So she was in charge of this group of women, and eventually they were brought to Auschwitz for killing in the crematoria. But before they went, I had a discussion with Ruth Schwartz that they were all going to get cyanide pills. That they had a lot of goods to trade with. I mean, they worked in the Kleiderkammer, and so they found gold and they found stuff, and they traded it with some of the SS for cyanide pills, because they all had cyanide pills, the SS. And each of them carried one with them when they were being sent to Auschwitz. And later on, when we came to Auschwitz, and I discussed this with Ruth, and my opinion at that time was, and continued to be, that we ought not do anything to shorten our own lives. That we should not give our lives away cheaply. That they have, if they're going to kill us, they have to kill us, and they have to feel it, and they have to see it. We mustn't do anything to hasten it. We must keep ourselves alive. We must keep ourselves healthy. And certainly taking our own lives would simply play into their hands. I was even against people who staged runaways. In other words, people who ran away. Because for every person who ran away, 10 were shot. And I didn't feel that I wanted to be shot for somebody else's running away, which may not even have been successful. Now, I may have been wrong, but that was my feeling. And so I discussed this with Ruth, and I said, it seems to me that taking a cyanide pill is giving them the edge. So she explained to me, you have never seen people die in a gas chamber, you don't know how terrible it is, and who can take this, and so on and so forth. In my ignorance, I kept insisting that they shouldn't do it. As it turned out, they apparently gave their cyanide pills, not all of them, but most of them, to the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. And when we came to Auschwitz, I found a Sonderkommando man who was able to tell me that they had come. And when they were taking us to get our heads shaven, there was a room, where the barbers were sitting higher up, and you had to stand below them, and they would just shave it. And so he said, so I said, have the people from Majdanek, has a Sonderkommando from Majdanek come? He says, yes, they did come. As a matter of fact, the cyanide pill from one of them belongs to one of the barbers. She works in the left-hand corner. She is the first one in the left-hand corner. So when we got to that room, I walked right over to her, and I said to her, my friend, Ruth Schwartz, gave you her cyanide pill. She was from Majdanek, and I don't want you to cut my hair. So she says, I have to do something. Well, as a result of that, the three of us were the only ones who did not have shaven heads.
And they let you through like that?
They let us through because we had waited for Mengele for a whole night. He was busy with something else, and we were there for a whole night waiting. We didn't know we were waiting for Mengele, but we were waiting, and everybody told us that we have to wait until this SS man who does a selection comes. And this Sonderkommando man, whom I contacted in order to get our shoes across. Now, shoes are the most important thing that you owned, if you owned it in the camps. Because if you didn't have shoes, your feet got sore, and once you had sores on your feet, they didn't heal. You couldn't keep up the pace, and you might as well have died. You were finished. In Majdanek, they took everything. Everything. I mean, the rings were cut off, earrings were pulled out of their lobes, every orifice was checked, all our documents, everything was taken away from us. As a matter of fact, my mother had her wedding ring, and she hadn't taken it off for a long time, and it was tight to get out, and I figured, they're not going to bother about a wedding ring. And the woman right in front of me in Majdanek had a similar situation. So the Aufseherin, a woman by the name of Alice Orlowska they called her, she says, that's no problem. And the Polak who actually did the collecting took a chopper and chopped off the woman's finger. So I said to my mother, I said, we're not going to go through that. So I let her go first, and I went right to this Aufseherin, and in my perfect German I said, ich würde es gerne runternehmen, aber es ist viel zu eng. Können Sie mir vielleicht helfen? So she says, yeah, gladly. And she took a pair of pliers and she cut off the ring. If not for that, they would have cut off the
finger.
And by the way, I said to her, would you cut off mine too? I had a little ring that apparently my grandmother had given my father to give to me, and I had put it on and never taken it off. And it was tight, so she cut that one too. So what I'm trying to say is they took everything in Majdanek. And our hair, she left that same terrible Aufseherin in Majdanek. When she looked at my sister and myself, I had long blonde braids, and my sister had darker brown, sort of brownish hair, and also thick braids, and they were cutting the hair. So she says, nein, die zwei nicht. So we were, we never had our hair completely shorn, which was very, very important. Now I started to talk about shoes. When they took away our shoes in Majdanek, they gave us instead these Ersatzschuhe, these substitutes. And what were they? The uppers were made of some kind of a paper combination, and the lowers were made of some kind of a wood combination. It wasn't real wood, it was a makeshift. And that sounded very good, except the wood and the paper separated as soon as it got wet. And so you walked, you had to tie it around, and you had to do all kinds of things. It was impossible to run fast, and you always had to run fast. And in the morning, you stood in the mud for as long as they wanted you to stand in these appels, and in the evening. And we were in Majdanek from the fall until the spring, so it was muddy and wintry and snowy. So we were in a terrible quandary about shoes. When we got to Plaszow from Majdanek, we were persona non grata, because we